Morning sunlight spilled through the tall windows of Ashbourne Manor, turning polished marble floors into ribbons of gold, yet Duchess Aloan Ashbourne measured the day not by light but by laughter. Before darkness claimed her sight, she had loved watching the gardens bloom. Now she listened to birds nesting beneath the ivy and smiled whenever their songs drifted through open windows. She rested one hand over the gentle curve of her pregnant belly while the other traced the carved edge of a chair, grounding herself in familiar textures. Blindness had stolen the world she once knew, but it had not stolen her tenderness, dignity, or quiet strength. Months earlier, a terrified servant boy had stumbled into the path of a runaway carriage during a violent storm. Without hesitation, Aloan had thrown herself forward, pushing the child to safety before the horses crashed into her. The boy escaped without a scratch. She awoke days later alive, carrying the child within her, yet the physicians delivered heartbreaking news. Her eyesight would never return. Duke Alaric Ashbourne had wept beside her bed, promising she would never face another sorrow alone. She believed every word because his trembling hands never left hers. For several weeks he honored that promise. He read poetry beside the fire, described sunsets she could no longer see, and guided her through gardens fragrant with roses and lavender. Their evenings became quieter, gentler, almost sacred. Aloan learned each hallway by counting careful steps, refusing to surrender to despair. She embroidered tiny baby clothes by touch alone, smiling whenever Alaric praised the neatness of every stitch. Those peaceful moments convinced her that love could survive any hardship. Then whispers entered the manor before dawn and lingered long after sunset. Noble guests lowered their voices whenever Aloan approached. Servants exchanged uneasy glances. At elegant dinners, conversations stopped as chairs scraped across polished floors. Lady Vivian Blackwood, Alaric's widowed cousin, arrived wrapped in graceful manners and hidden ambition. Her sympathy sounded sincere, yet every comforting sentence carried invisible poison. She remarked that neighboring dukes questioned whether a blind duchess could inspire confidence. She wondered aloud whether frightened tenants deserved a stronger figure beside their ruler. She never directly insulted Aloan. Instead, she planted doubt inside grieving hearts and waited patiently for it to grow. Alaric resisted at first. He defended his wife before every gathering, dismissing cruel gossip with icy confidence. Yet relentless pressure exhausted him. Advisors warned investors were withdrawing support. Merchants feared instability. Rival families quietly mocked Ashbourne leadership. Each report chipped away at his certainty. Pride disguised itself as responsibility until he convinced himself that sacrificing personal happiness might protect thousands depending upon the duchy. Aloan sensed the distance before anyone admitted it. His footsteps became hurried. His voice lost warmth. Shared meals shortened into strained silences. One evening she reached across the dining table searching for his hand, expecting familiar comfort. Her fingertips met empty air. She heard his chair slide backward. "I have work awaiting me," he murmured. She forced a smile although tears threatened. Work has never feared waiting before. He hesitated only a heartbeat before leaving. The echo of the closing door sounded colder than winter. Later that night, Aloan sat beside the nursery cradle being crafted for their unborn child. With patient fingers she folded miniature blankets stitched from soft cream linen. She imagined tiny hands gripping her own and whispered into the quiet room, "Your father loves us. He has simply forgotten how to hear his own heart." Unknown to her, Alaric stood outside the half-open door listening. His eyes filled with regret, yet he walked away before she sensed his presence. Lady Vivian seized every opportunity. She arranged meetings highlighting failing harvests and exaggerated financial losses. Forged letters suggested neighboring lords planned rebellion unless the Duke removed his supposedly fragile wife from public life. Each deception tightened around Alaric like invisible chains. He stopped questioning evidence because believing it seemed easier than confronting his own fear. Days later, Aloan accidentally knocked an ancestral crystal vase from its pedestal while navigating the great hall. The shattering glass echoed through the manor. Silence followed. Alaric arrived moments later. Instead of asking whether she was hurt, he stared at the broken heirlooms scattered across the floor. "Perhaps this house has become too dangerous for you," he said quietly. His words pierced deeper than shattered glass. That evening official documents awaited his signature. They declared the Duchess would temporarily reside at an abandoned countryside estate until circumstances improved. Vivian called it protection. Advisors called it necessity. Alaric called it duty, though the pen trembled between his fingers. Before dawn, unaware that betrayal had already begun, Alolan kissed the nursery cradle, gathered only a few cherished belongings, and stepped into a lonely carriage carrying hope, heartbreak, and the child who would soon change every destiny. The carriage rolled farther from Ashbourne Manor until even the distant church bells faded into silence. Alolan sat upright despite every jolt along the uneven road, one hand resting protectively over her unborn child while the other clutched the small bundle containing a few dresses, baby clothes she had sewn by touch, and a silver locket holding a miniature portrait she could no longer see. She refused to cry before the servants accompanying her because dignity was the last possession no one could confiscate. Hours passed beneath gathering clouds. The horses slowed unexpectedly before stopping altogether. Whispered voices drifted outside, followed by footsteps retreating into the distance. Alolan waited patiently, believing someone would help her down. Instead, only the restless wind answered. She called softly, then louder, but no familiar voice replied. The carriage door creaked open without a greeting. A rough shove sent her stumbling onto damp earth. Before she regained her balance, the carriage wheels rattled away, carrying the servants, supplies, and horses with them. Lady Vivian's secret orders had been fulfilled. Alone beside an unfamiliar road, Alolan steadied herself against a weathered milestone. The scent of wet pine filled the air while distant thunder rolled across the hills. Fear pressed against her chest, yet she inhaled deeply and whispered, "I still have you." Her unborn child shifted gently, and she accepted the tiny movement as an answer. Guided only by the sound of a nearby stream, she carefully followed the uneven ground, counting every cautious step to keep panic from overwhelming her. Rain began falling before long. Cold droplets soaked her cloak and tangled her hair. Her boots slipped across muddy stones until exhaustion finally forced her to kneel beneath the shelter of an ancient oak. She folded her arms around herself, shivering but refusing despair. Memories of Alaric's promises tried to return, yet she gently pushed them aside. Dwelling on broken vows would not lead her toward safety. Survival demanded every ounce of courage she possessed. Not far away, an elderly woman gathering medicinal herbs noticed the unusual silence between flashes of lightning. Instead of frightened cries, she heard someone quietly humming a lullaby. Curious, she approached and discovered the blind Duchess sitting beneath the tree, soaked to the bone yet calmly soothing the child within her. The old healer introduced herself as Martha, a retired midwife who had served generations of village families. She offered a warm blanket before asking any questions, an act of kindness that nearly broke Alolan's carefully guarded composure. Martha guided her to a modest cottage where fresh bread baked beside a crackling fire. The comforting aroma wrapped around Alolan like forgotten happiness. She thanked her host repeatedly, embarrassed by accepting charity from a stranger. Martha merely laughed, insisting that compassion multiplied whenever it was shared. While drying Alolan's clothes, she listened quietly to the painful story without interrupting once. When silence finally settled between them, the old woman simply squeezed Alolan's hand and said, "A cruel decision never defines the worth of the one who suffers it." The following morning Martha escorted Alolan toward the abandoned countryside estate that legally remained under Ashbourne ownership. Every creaking gate and broken fence testified to years of neglect. The manor roof leaked. Empty stables echoed hollowly. Weeds swallowed neglected gardens once designed for beauty. Nearby cottages leaned dangerously, and hungry children watched the newcomers with cautious eyes. Their parents offered respectful greetings, yet hopelessness weighed heavily within every voice. They expected another noble who would leave after witnessing such misery. Instead, Alolan requested to walk through the grounds herself. Guided only by Martha's arm and the sounds surrounding her, she traced cracked stone walls, touched splintered doors, and knelt to feel the dry soil between her fingers. She smiled faintly. "This land is tired," she murmured, "not lifeless." The villagers exchanged puzzled glances. That afternoon she gathered everyone willing to listen beneath an old oak overlooking the neglected fields. She admitted she could not repair roofs with her own hands or inspect distant harvests with her eyes. Yet she promised she would never abandon people simply because life had wounded them. Her honesty reached hearts that polished speeches never could. For the first time in years, cautious hope stirred among families who had almost forgotten its feeling. The next days became a quiet rhythm of determination. Martha described every room until Aloan memorized the manner by counting footsteps and recognizing each doorway through touch. She organized the neglected pantry, discovering forgotten sacks of barley still fit for planting. She sold the last jeweled bracelet she possessed so villagers could purchase seed, simple tools, and medicine before winter deepened. When hungry children arrived shyly at the kitchen door, she insisted every meal be shared equally, including her own portion. One evening, while helping knead bread beside laughing village women, Aloan heard hesitant footsteps lingering outside. A little girl's frightened voice whispered that 3 orphan siblings had arrived after fever claimed both parents in a neighboring settlement. No family believed they could feed extra mouths through the coming winter. Without hesitation, Aloan stood, brushed flour from her sleeves, and asked Martha to lead the children inside. As tiny trembling hands found hers, something extraordinary settled over the silent room. She could not see their faces, yet she already knew that destiny had quietly delivered far more than hungry strangers to her lonely door.
The 3 children entered the warm kitchen so quietly that even the crackling fire seemed louder than their footsteps. The oldest girl held the hands of her younger brother and sister with determined protectiveness, though fear trembled beneath every breath she took. Their clothes were threadbare, their cheeks hollow from hunger, and their boots caked with dried mud from days of wandering. Aloan knelt before them without hesitation, extending both hands until the smallest child shyly placed tiny fingers against her palms. She smiled, feeling innocence instead of strangers. "My name is Aloan," she said gently. "May I know yours?" The oldest answered with cautious dignity. "I am Clara. This is Finn, and this is Rosie." Rosie clung tightly to Clara's skirt, too frightened to speak. Finn lowered his head, refusing to meet anyone's gaze even though Aloan could not have seen him. Martha quietly explained that sickness had swept through a neighboring hamlet weeks earlier. Their parents had cared for the ill until they themselves succumbed. Since then the children had survived by sleeping in abandoned barns and accepting scraps from passing travelers. Silence settled across the room. Every villager understood that another family meant more mouths to feed during an already difficult season. Some looked away in quiet sympathy while others silently calculated how little grain remained. No one wished the children harm, yet desperation often defeated compassion. Aloan gently squeezed Rosie's trembling hands. "Have you eaten today?" The little girl barely whispered. "We shared 1 apple yesterday." Without another word, Aloan divided the fresh bread cooling upon the table into equal pieces. She handed the largest portions to the children before accepting the smallest for herself. Rosie stared at the warm loaf in disbelief. "Aren't you hungry too?" she asked. Aloan smiled softly. "I have already been fed." She had not. Watching the children devour every crumb filled the kitchen with quiet emotion. Clara repeatedly thanked her between bites while Finn silently wiped away tears, ashamed that hunger had overwhelmed his manners. Aloan never commented. She simply listened to them eat, grateful that full stomachs often restored hope faster than comforting words. Later that evening the villagers gathered inside the modest manor to discuss the children's future. Several families offered temporary shelter, yet none believed they could provide permanently. Winter promised hardship for everyone. Aloan listened carefully before rising. "If no home can be found," she said calmly, "then let this house become theirs." A stunned silence followed. One farmer stepped forward respectfully. "Your Grace, you are expecting your own child. Caring for 1 infant will already demand everything you have." She nodded. Then my child will grow beside brothers and sisters instead of loneliness. Another villager hesitated. You possess almost nothing. Eloan rested one hand upon her unborn baby. Love has never depended upon wealth. The discussion ended there. From that evening onward Clara, Finn, and Rosie remained beneath her roof. The days gradually found a comforting rhythm. Clara eagerly learned household responsibilities, determined to repay kindness with tireless work. Finn possessed remarkable patience repairing broken tools alongside elderly craftsmen. Rosie followed Eloan everywhere, happily describing flowers, birds, clouds, and sunsets in wonderfully imperfect detail. Every evening she invented colorful descriptions that often wandered far from reality, yet Eloan treasured each one because they allowed her to imagine beauty through another child's eyes. The neglected estate slowly awakened. Villagers repaired collapsed fences together. Unused fields were cleared. Old fruit trees received careful pruning. Children collected stones from farmland while adults rebuilt crumbling irrigation channels abandoned years before. Eloan could not swing heavy hammers or inspect distant crops, yet she united everyone through encouragement rather than authority. She remembered every voice, every concern, every family member. People soon realized the blind Duchess noticed suffering more clearly than many-sided rulers. One chilly afternoon a widowed shepherd arrived carrying an injured lamb. The frightened animal had broken its leg after falling into a ditch. Many suggested ending its misery because feeding an animal unlikely to survive seemed foolish. Eloan knelt beside the trembling creature, gently running her fingertips across its injured limb. Every life deserves the chance to heal, she whispered. Martha carefully set the bone while village children gathered soft blankets. Weeks later the lamb limped happily across green pasture. The simple miracle spread through neighboring settlements, inspiring people who had long forgotten that kindness could become contagious. Winter approached with relentless determination. Snow-covered rooftops. Cold winds rattled weakened shutters. Food remained limited despite everyone's efforts. Eloan quietly reduced her own meals so every child received enough nourishment. Martha noticed but said nothing until one evening she discovered Eloan pretending she had already eaten. You cannot feed others by starving yourself, the old midwife scolded gently. Eloan laughed softly. Then tonight you shall sit beside me until every bowl is empty. From that day forward Martha personally ensured Eloan never skipped another meal. Soon labor pains arrived beneath swirling snowflakes. The entire village gathered anxiously outside the manor while Martha directed the birth inside the warmest room. Hours stretched endlessly. Every cry pierced hearts waiting beyond the closed door. Clara held Rosie's hand tightly while Finn silently prayed beside the fireplace. Finally the unmistakable cry of a healthy newborn echoed throughout the house. Joy erupted. Neighbors embraced one another. Church bells rang across the valley. Martha emerged carrying a smiling infant wrapped securely inside soft cream blankets stitched months earlier by Eloan's patient hands. A healthy son, she announced proudly. Tears flowed freely.
When Martha placed the baby within Eloan's arms, the exhausted mother gently traced his tiny face with trembling fingertips, memorizing every delicate feature through touch. She named him Theodore, honoring her late father whose quiet wisdom had taught her that true strength always walked beside compassion. The children instantly surrounded their newest brother. Clara promised to protect him forever. Finn carefully carved a small wooden horse as his first gift. Rosie eagerly described Theodore's bright eyes, tiny nose, and sleepy smile until Eloan laughed through grateful tears. Weeks became months. The manor transformed from a lonely exile into a genuine home overflowing with shared purpose. Villagers no longer visited merely seeking help. They arrived bringing bread, vegetables, repaired furniture, blankets, and music. Every contribution strengthened bonds that wealth alone could never purchase. One crisp spring morning, Martha guided Eloan through flourishing gardens where herbs now scented the fresh air. Bees hummed among blossoms planted by village children. Birds nested beneath newly repaired roofs. The once abandoned estate breathed with renewed life. "What do you hear?" Martha asked. Eloan closed her sightless eyes. "I hear people who no longer sound afraid." Far away, within the grandeur of Ashbourne Manor, Duke Alaric sat alone before towering windows overlooking empty gardens that once echoed with laughter. Reports of failing harvests, unpaid debts, and growing unrest covered his desk like gathering storm clouds. Yet among the endless documents lay one brief letter from a passing merchant. It contained only a single sentence. "The abandoned countryside estate has begun to flourish under the guidance of its blind duchess." Alaric read those words again and again, unable to understand how the woman he had believed too fragile to survive had somehow begun creating hope where he had expected only silence. The merchant's letter refused to leave Alaric's thoughts. He carried it from his study to the dining hall, then back again, reading its single sentence until the parchment softened beneath his fingers. Every report describing the countryside contradicted the image he had clung to for months. He had imagined loneliness, failure, and regret. Instead, travelers spoke of repaired homes, healthy harvests, generous markets, and villagers who praised a blind duchess with unwavering affection. The impossible truth unsettled him more deeply than any accusation ever could. Lady Vivian dismissed every rumor with effortless confidence. She insisted sentimental peasants exaggerated ordinary improvements into miraculous tales. She produced carefully prepared financial records proving the remote estate contributed almost nothing to the duchy's treasury. Yet Alaric noticed small inconsistencies that had escaped him before. Numbers failed to match earlier accounts. Official seals appeared slightly uneven. Deliveries supposedly completed had never reached their destinations. Tiny doubts, once ignored, gathered into uncomfortable questions. Determined to learn the truth, Alaric summoned several merchants separately. Without knowing one another had been questioned, each described remarkably similar scenes. Children attended lessons inside restored cottages. Elderly villagers received food without payment. Abandoned fields produced healthy grain once again. Travelers found shelter without being turned away. Most astonishing of all, every witness spoke of the blind duchess not with pity but with admiration. That evening Alaric wandered through the silent nursery prepared years earlier for the child he had never met. Dust covered the cradle Eloan had once touched so lovingly. Tiny blankets remained folded exactly where she had left them. He picked one up, recognizing the careful embroidery stitched entirely by touch after blindness had stolen her sight. For the first time since signing the exile order, shame overwhelmed every excuse he had built around his decision. Meanwhile, life at the countryside estate continued with quiet purpose. Spring sunshine warmed the orchards while Theodore laughed from a blanket spread beneath blooming apple trees. Clara practiced reading aloud with younger children gathered beneath the shade. Finn proudly repaired a broken cart alongside village craftsmen, his confidence growing with every successful task. Rosie skipped happily between flower beds, describing colorful blossoms to Eloan in delightfully exaggerated detail. Eloan herself had become the gentle heartbeat of the community. She recognized approaching visitors by the rhythm of their footsteps and remembered birthdays, illnesses, and family celebrations without ever needing reminders. Villagers no longer saw blindness before seeing wisdom. Whenever disagreements threatened friendships, they sought her calm counsel. Whenever hardship returned, they left carrying renewed hope. One afternoon an exhausted traveler collapsed outside the manor gates. His horse had stumbled after days without proper rest. Instead of questioning whether he could pay, Eloan instructed everyone to prepare food, clean bandages, and a warm bed. The stranger recovered enough to reveal he carried supplies toward villages struck by failed harvests beyond the mountains. Without hesitation, Eloan ordered several wagons filled with grain, dried herbs, blankets, and preserved vegetables. Martha looked concerned. "Our own stores are comfortable, not endless." Eloan smiled gently. "If abundance stops at our gates, then we have misunderstood its purpose." The wagons departed before sunrise. Weeks later grateful families arrived carrying handmade gifts instead of payment. Some offered carved furniture. Others brought healthy livestock or rare fruit trees. Every generous act returned multiplied, strengthening the estate far beyond what careful hoarding ever could. Far away, Ashbourne Manor faced increasing unrest. Failed investments emptied coffers. Trusted advisors quietly resigned. Tenants complained of neglected roads and unfair taxes imposed to cover mounting losses. Alaric discovered several contracts bearing his signature had been altered after he approved them. Piece by piece, the comfortable certainty surrounding Lady Vivian's guidance began collapsing. He confronted his cousin privately. She remained perfectly composed. "You sacrificed one woman to protect thousands," she replied smoothly. "History rewards difficult decisions." Alaric stared silently before asking the question he had avoided for months. What if the decision protected no one? For the first time, Vivian offered no immediate answer. That sleepless night Alaric entered the family chapel alone. Candlelight flickered across ancient stone walls while silence pressed heavily around him. He knelt before the altar, not asking for victory or wealth, but for the courage to face whatever truth awaited him. Memories returned with painful clarity, Eloan laughing among roses before the accident, patiently learning every hallway after losing her sight, whispering hope to their unborn child even after he had withdrawn his affection. None of those memories resembled weakness. Every one reflected extraordinary strength he had refused to recognize. At sunrise he summoned his most trusted stablemaster. "Prepare only 2 horses," Alaric instructed quietly. "No banners. No escort. I am riding to the countryside." As the gates opened behind him, the great manor seemed emptier than ever before. Ahead stretched the long road leading toward the woman he had abandoned, the son he had never held, and a future he no longer deserved but could not stop hoping might still contain one final chance. Unseen beyond distant hills, children laughed within blooming orchards as Eloan suddenly paused, tilting her head toward the wind, her peaceful smile fading as though her heart had somehow recognized that familiar footsteps were finally coming home. Dawn painted the countryside with soft shades of gold as Duke Alaric rode through rolling fields toward the estate he had once dismissed as a place of quiet exile. Instead of abandoned cottages and barren soil, he found orchards heavy with fruit, children laughing beside clear streams, and villagers greeting one another with genuine warmth. Fresh flowers climbed repaired stone walls, windmills turned steadily above thriving grain fields, and every smiling face reflected the quiet prosperity born from kindness rather than fear. The sight humbled him before he even reached the manor gates. Theodore chased a wooden hoop across the courtyard while Clara hung freshly washed blankets beneath the spring sunshine. Finn carefully guided younger boys repairing a chicken coop, and Rosie skipped through flower beds gathering wild daisies for Eloan. When the children noticed the unfamiliar rider, their laughter faded into cautious silence. Martha stepped outside carrying a basket of herbs and immediately recognized the Duke. Her expression remained calm, though disappointment lingered within tired eyes that had witnessed Eloan's deepest suffering. Without anger or ceremony, Martha simply said, "She is in the garden." Alaric walked alone beneath blossoming apple trees until he heard gentle laughter carried by the breeze. Eloan sat on a wooden bench surrounded by fragrant lavender while Rosie eagerly described butterflies dancing among the flowers. Theodore rested happily beside his mother, leaning against her shoulder as she listened with peaceful contentment. Though her sight remained lost, serenity illuminated her face more brightly than sunlight. She lifted her head before anyone spoke. "I know those footsteps," she whispered. Alaric stopped only a few paces away. "So do I," he answered quietly. "I was simply too proud to follow them sooner." Rosie instinctively moved closer to Eloan, while Theodore studied the stranger with innocent curiosity. Clara and Finn quietly approached from behind, forming a protective circle around the woman who had become their entire world. Alaric slowly knelt upon the grass. "I have come to ask for nothing except the chance to tell the truth." Eloan remained silent. "I believed lies because they were easier than trusting the woman who had never once betrayed me. I allowed fear to disguise itself as duty. I abandoned you when you needed me most. Every day since then has revealed the cost of my cowardice." No one interrupted. "I cannot erase what I did. I do not deserve forgiveness. But I will spend the rest of my life deserving the chance to earn it. Tears quietly filled Martha's eyes. Before Alolan could respond, galloping horses thundered toward the estate. Villagers turned in alarm as Lady Vivian arrived with several hired guards, believing the prosperous countryside could still become her prize. She publicly accused Alolan of stealing Ashbourne property and declared the estate would immediately return under her authority. Fear rippled through the gathered crowd. Then something remarkable happened. Farmers stepped forward. Blacksmiths joined them. Teachers, shepherds, widows, craftsmen, and children formed a living wall before Alolan. No weapons. Only unwavering loyalty. One elderly farmer spoke firmly. Our Lady stayed when everyone else abandoned us. Another villager added, if anyone leaves today, it will not be her. Vivian ordered her guards forward. Before they moved, Alaric stepped between them and Alolan. No one touches my wife again. His voice carried the quiet certainty of a man who finally understood what truly mattered. He turned toward the guards. I am still your duke. Stand down. Recognizing lawful authority, every guard lowered his weapon. Vivian's confidence shattered. Alaric calmly produced the forged contracts and altered financial records uncovered during his investigation. Witnesses from the capital stepped forward confirming years of theft, deception, and deliberate manipulation. Surrounded by undeniable evidence, Vivian could no longer hide behind elegant words. She was peacefully taken into custody to face justice according to the law she had twisted for personal ambition. Silence returned. Alaric faced the villagers. Then, before nobles, farmers, servants, and children alike, he removed the ducal signet ring from his hand and placed it upon the ground. I ruled through pride, he said. She ruled through compassion. If this duchy deserves a leader, it deserves the one standing before you. The crowd erupted into heartfelt applause. Alolan slowly approached until she stood before him. Her fingertips gently found his face, tracing lines carved by regret and sleepless nights. For several long moments neither spoke. Finally she smiled. I cannot forget. I know. I cannot pretend the pain never happened. I would never ask you to. She took a slow breath. But I can choose whether pain has the final word. She extended her hand. Alaric accepted it with trembling gratitude. The children surrounded them almost instantly. Rosie hugged his waist. Theodore reached for his father's hand without hesitation. Clara smiled through tears she no longer tried hiding, while Finn quietly presented the small wooden horse he had carved years earlier, offering it to the father he had once feared. Life continued not with grand celebrations alone but with countless ordinary joys that proved healing had truly taken root. Alaric remained in the countryside, working beside villagers each day instead of returning immediately to the capital. Roads were rebuilt. Schools expanded. A free clinic opened inside the restored manor. The abandoned palace became an orphan refuge, honoring Alolan's belief that every child deserved both safety and love. Several months later, beneath blooming apple trees where forgiveness first blossomed, the family gathered with the entire village. There were no jeweled crowns or extravagant ceremonies. Rosie proudly carried 2 simple rings woven from wildflowers. Theodore laughed while scattering fresh petals across the grass. Clara read heartfelt vows aloud because Alolan wanted every promise spoken clearly. Finn planted a young oak nearby, promising it would grow with their family. When Alaric asked if she would walk beside him for the rest of their lives, Alolan answered without hesitation. Only if we never leave kindness behind again. I promise. Years later travelers crossed the duchy not to admire wealth but to witness the remarkable village where mercy transformed despair into hope. For children grew together without distinction between blood and adoption. Every inheritance was shared equally, exactly as Alaric declared before the entire duchy. Whenever strangers asked how such happiness had become possible, villagers simply smiled toward the flourishing orchards and answered that one blind woman had seen what everyone else had overlooked. Love becomes strongest when it is freely given, forgiveness becomes greatest when it is honestly earned, and even the deepest exile can become the beginning of the most beautiful home.